Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I'm Anthony. It has been a while since I posted a video. It has been a pretty chaotic year for me. I think I have been traveling nearly non-stop this entire year. It has been a wild ride to say the least, and I've unfortunately not had the time to just be able to sit down, record, edit, and release videos. That doesn't mean I wasn't still working on scripts and doing research into beer history and everything like that. And that's actually what I want to talk about today. I would like to talk about some of the interesting history I've discovered along my travels. Most recently, I have just had the amazing privilege to visit the tiny Mediterranean island nation of Malta. It has a thriving beer industry. There are tons of beer. Everyone's drinking. It is greatly embraced beer culture in the modern era. So I started going to all their ancient sites and visiting the historic temples where that's usually where you're able to uncover these little hidden and forgotten secrets. But Malta did not really provide that for me. Not in that sense, not in the beer history sense. In fact, most sources actually say that Malta's beer history doesn't start until the 1960s, which I find incredibly hard to believe since that region, almost every nation and culture in that area has long beer history. So I was like, how is Malta such an oddball? Why is it the exception to this rule? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Malta's weird, kind of long, but not really, beer history. To uncover it, we have to start at the very beginning of Malta itself. Malta was not inhabited by people until around 5,900 BC. The commonly accepted theory nowadays is that Malta was firstly inhabited by a seafaring people coming from Sicily, another nearby island off of Italy. The Sicily people were prolific farmers in their own right. There is evidence of them harvesting and having agricultural efforts for grains and wild cereals dating back thousands of years. And although most sources say that beer was introduced to the Sicilian people around 750 BC, there isn't a whole lot of evidence suggesting for or against them being prolific brewers in their own right, utilizing that grain and that cereal. But I find it hard to believe that they weren't. And if they were, why didn't they bring it with them to Malta when they got there? The most prominent theory I could come up with is that Malta was just unable to sustain agricultural efforts the way that the Sicily people were used to. If you look at Malta nowadays, it is incredibly hot. It doesn't receive a lot of rain. There's not a lot of natural water resources, and it's kind of dry and deserty. And most of their agriculture is very small and very limited, and they actually import most of their fruits and vegetables. So still to this day, maintaining a beer, homegrown beer industry with all local ingredients seems nearly impossible. In fact, when you look at the collapse of this early Sicily colony, if you want to call it that, on Malta, their actual downfall was from poor agricultural efforts. At least that's the leading theory. Now, with that idea, it makes sense that the early Maltese were not beer brewing people because there was no beer to be brewed. Everything that they were able to harvest and were able to maintain had to go to food resources instead of beverage resources. And when you factor in theories that other paleontologists and archaeobotanists that they put forth, you really see that Malta was not primed, because a lot of theories suggest that if you sway away from the beer as foundation theory, you see that people will put forth the idea that civilizations didn't actually start brewing beer until they had an excess or a surplus of grains. If there was too much grains, they ran into storage issues, which could either have gone wrong and fermented, accidentally creating beer that was later on purposefully recreated, or they had to figure out a way to take big dry grain bulk amounts and turn it into something rapidly digestible. That way they could get rid of it, still get the nutrients, and beer was the solution. According to that theory, the early Maltese did not need to brew beer because they were unable to grow enough grain to run into that storage problem, that storage issue. Possibly they were unable to grow it. What they did grow was not enough. Other theories suggest that possibly they just didn't need to make something so nutritionally dense like beer because their diets were supplemented by possible other agricultural efforts or hunting gathering activities going on across the island. Or maybe it was a combination of all these theories. Regardless, the point of this conversation is the early Maltese were not beer brewers. At least we don't have any evidence of it. Anyways, this early non-beer brewing culture eventually fell, as I mentioned earlier. And Malta was actually abandoned for a long period of time. And then it started to be discovered once again and repopulated by a huge amount of cultures. We saw the Phoenicians, we saw the Greeks, we saw the Knights of St. John, African Arabs, the Ottomans. I mean, wave after wave of people over the next several thousand years, swarmed the island, at some point of time or another. And we know that many of those cultures were brewing beer at home, and it's likely that they brought it with them, or at least the practice or the reserves, on their vessels to Malta. So we could at least theorize that beer in some capacity was brought to Malta during this long time period throughout the Bronze, Iron Age, all the way up until like the Classical period, The UK took control of Malta from the Napoleonic French around 1880. And it was at this point in time that they actually started using Malta as kind of like their naval base in the Mediterranean. It was their garrison for sailors, naval vessels, and military men to further their distribution networks, but also be able to rapidly deploy them to other regions. They had colonies all through Africa and other parts of the Mediterranean at that point in time. And Malta was kind of like their home base. And all these newcomers to the islands, they were all huge beer drinkers. I mean, still in the UK to this day, they're a prolific drinking people. So they actually started setting up beer distribution networks from the British Isles all the way down into the Mediterranean for their naval vessels and for their military men to be able to continue drinking and getting their proper rations. It seemed that the Maltese were actually pretty favorable towards this new influx of beer. We started seeing a lot more consumption of beer from the local population, and that became a huge economic boom for breweries back in the British Isles who were exporting down to Malta and throughout the Mediterranean and Africa. One brewery in particular, Simon's, they actually set up a whole distribution network through Malta, and they were making an absolute killing off of it. Seeing how much money that was out there, out in the water, the potential for financial success of their own, a wealthy Maltese businessman actually decided he wanted to get into the brewery game himself. They wanted to be able to open up Malta's first organic national brewery. And working with his sons, they ended up coming out with the Farsons, which is an anglicized fusion of Ferrugia and Sons. That way it would appeal a bit better to the new English sailors that were coming in there, Their brewery opened up in the early 1900s, and it was pretty successful all in all, but they were a little bit at a disadvantage. They had to receive all their grain and their hops and even water from the distribution networks coming from the UK, but they still did pretty well for themselves. Enough to the point where Simon's actually saw them as a little bit of a threat. So in the early 1910s, they actually fused forces together to become Simon Farsons. Local organic brewery with an anglicized name that captured the hearts of the British, the English, that captured the hearts of the Maltese people. And with that dedicated distribution network coming from the UK, Farsons was able to brew British beers using British ingredients, British hops, British malts, all that stuff, and recreate like traditional English style ales that they were then able to distribute throughout Malta and continue on with the Simon's distribution network across the empire. Together, this beer couple, this power couple, they dominated the Maltese market for several decades, and they became completely ingrained into the Maltese beer culture that was slowly emerging. However, things were about to get shaken up pretty heavily with the release of a little brand known as Chisk. It would be absolutely impossible to talk about the history of Maltese beer without talking about Chisk. Chisk is Maltese beer. This is the definition of beer in Malta. You can't be further than an arm's reach away from a cold can of Chisk if you're on the islands. Chisk was actually formed around 1928 to be released in 1929. There was a Maltese banker who was pretty prolific, and he kind of revolutionized the Maltese economy in his earlier business ventures, but he wanted to kind of expand. He wanted to dip his toes into a little diversification of his portfolio. And one of the people that he had been working with was the Malta Export Brewery. And they were kind of struggling and they weren't doing so well. So his bank actually ended up taking full ownership and control over the Malta Export Brewery and revitalizing it to become a powerhouse of its own. Now, at this point in time, we need to talk about what beer in Malta is kind of like. Maltese beer is predominantly ales, coming from the huge influence from the UK, which is largely a ale drinking nation. When they came down to Malta, they carried on their traditions. They carried on doing what they know, which is drinking ale and brewing ale and bringing ale places. So, wanting to stand out, they decided the best thing that they could do was diversify, become a lager brewery. So they solidified those rights. They reached out, they got a Bavarian brewer and architect to come down, design their brewery, come up with a beautiful, crisp, clean Bavarian Pilsner recipe, and Chisk was born, named after that businessman who ran this whole operation, who schemed it all up. Chisk was insanely popular upon its release in 1929. I mean, it was just so drastically different than everything else on the market at that time. It was smoother, it was crisper, and it was brewed in the traditional Bavarian way, the Bavarian lager method. So, I mean, it had a little history and a little intrigue to it. It was just something different, and it helped it stand out, which made it successful. Until the two decided the smartest idea is that they once again fuse together and form a Maltese brewing powerhouse conglomerate. We saw the rise of Sigmund Farsson's Chisk. And for nearly a century, they completely dominated the Maltese market. Malta gained its independence in 1960, which is where I think the whole idea of its beer history doesn't start till 1960 thing kind of comes from. Anyways, it joined the European Union shortly after gaining its independence and its sovereignty, and that kind of had some positive things and some negative things depending on your perspective. So one of the things that happens when you join the EU is that you kind of enter into a free trade agreement with the rest of the member states, which meant that at this point in time, where Sigmund Farsson's Chisk had a near monopoly over Malta's beer industry, we now saw this huge influx of a wide range of beer brands coming from all across Europe. This was very good for the Maltese drinker and for the tourist, but maybe not so great for the local homegrown breweries. They were definitely seeing some market share slip going on there, but I think that they ended up being able to solidify their foothold and maintaining a definitive control of their market, although a little bit more crowded. But in the 2010s, that big conglomerate saw its new competition, which was the rise of local Maltese craft beer. Currently in Malta, there's like one or two bigger, more well-known craft breweries, which is Husky and Lord Chambre. They are kind of like the pioneers and the front runners in the craft beer movement. However, all across Malta, you'll find, small little gastro pubs that sell pub food and they brew their own beer in-house. There are some Maltese brewers who actually operate their production facilities in mainland Europe and distribute their beer directly down to Malta, specifically for the Maltese market. I think the one that comes to my mind is Strata. They actually brew in both Belgium and Poland, and there's a couple more, and they're kind of doing that because still the craft beer industry is facing the same problems that we talked about all the way back in the Neolithic period, which is it's very difficult to meet the agricultural needs to operate and run a brewery because Malta is incapable of growing large amounts of grain, and it's damn near impossible to grow hops. In fact, Malta even has to import its water because the vast majority of water in Malta out of the sink, out of the faucet, is desalinized salt water, and the process and the chemicals that are used to treat it creates a challenging aquatic flavor, and that can wreak havoc on your beers if you're trying to brew with it. So large amounts of water actually have to be imported into Malta for these breweries to be able to run and operate. That's why when Chisk actually created their new brewery following the major conglomerate fusion, they had to build it near an ancient Roman aqueduct and tap into underground water reserves, in addition to adding vats and reserves on top of the building to be able to capture any type of rainfall or morning dew or any type of water that was falling from the sky to be able to supplement their brewing procedures. Maltese craft beer is very interesting in and of itself, and that's because across my journeys across Europe, I have noticed that most of them, most countries, their craft breweries try to replicate what is going on in the American craft beer industry. I mean, that's kind of where that whole boom started. So it kind of makes sense, especially since it's popular, it's trendy and everything. But what I noticed in Malta is they are still English ale based. You're going to see tons of pale ales. You're going to see a lot of pale ales. You're going to see porters and stouts. And, you can see that kind of elsewhere. But most of them will say this is like an English IPA. This is an English pale ale. They are still holding very aggressively onto their beer past, their beer history, and I think that is incredibly cool. Maybe that's because what they know and what they're good at, maybe it's easier for them to do than all the amount of resources and finances that go into a lager, or maybe it's just because that's what the Maltese people enjoy. They like that old English style flavor. They just want it in new and exciting packages. So either way, I think that's incredibly interesting and helps them stand out even further, in my opinion. Now, what also was very interesting about that English UK influence is that it actually tastes more like what my brain thinks UK craft beer would taste like than what UK craft beer actually is. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of my experiences with UK craft beer, they're kind of like everyone else, and they're kind of doing things in the American way. This is certainly much more English influence than what you see in English craft breweries. That might be a hot take, but in my personal experience, I think that is wholeheartedly true. But it's that fusion, that interesting take of cultures, ideas, and concepts that makes Malta special. Malta as a nation, Malta's cuisine, and Malta's beer is a hodgepodge of influences. It is a true melting pot. It is a fusion of cultures, and it comes out with amazingly interesting and unique products. And if I just cannot talk about how great Malta's beer, it is a beer bastion unparalleled in the region. And I really think it should be on every beer drinker's bucket list. So I hope you learned something. I hope I gauged your interest in visiting Malta and trying their beers. I hope you liked. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.